If you have ever stood somewhere that was supposed to be the beginning of your life and felt instead that it was the end of everything you thought you understood, then you already know how Iris Merritt Colby felt the afternoon the Union Pacific set her down at Greystone Pass. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment and tell me because I want to know. If you love slow burn frontier romances, the kind where two people find each other, not because the world arranged it neatly, but because they were the only ones left standing in the same place at the right time, then go ahead and subscribe. So the next story finds you when the house is quiet and the evening has nothing left to ask of you. Now come sit closer. There is a blizzard coming in off the Absaroka range, and a young woman is standing alone on a platform with two trunks and a letter that no longer means what she thought it meant, and I don't think we should leave her there any longer than necessary. The train had been 2 hours late out of Cheyenne. The conductor had been apologetic about this in the careful, practiced way that men are apologetic when the fault belongs to the weather and there is genuinely nothing to be done about it. And Iris had thanked him and turned back to the window and watched the country change. The high plains had been dropping away for the past hour, the long brown distances giving way to the first serious ridges of the territory, pine dark and enormous against the pale December sky. She had never been this far west. She had grown up in northern Ohio and spent 4 years in Chicago, and she understood in a general and somewhat theoretical way that the country west of the Missouri was different from the country east of it. But understanding a thing in a general and theoretical way and watching it appear outside a train window are two different orders of knowing. And what appeared outside this window was the first order of knowing she had yet had. She was 26 years old. She had a firm handshake, dark red-brown hair that she kept pinned up except when she was sleeping, gray-green eyes that her mother had always called thoughtful and her father had always called sharp, and the particular kind of composure that develops in women who have spent 4 years managing 32 children at a time in a schoolroom that smelled of coal smoke and wet wool, and the specific exhaustion of good work done in insufficient conditions. She had been a teacher at Moorfield Elementary School in Chicago since the autumn of 1878. She was by every external measure good at it. She liked children not in the sentimental abstract way that people who have not spent much time with them claim to like them, but in the concrete specific way of a person who genuinely enjoyed watching a child figure something out. She liked the process of a mind opening to a new fact, the particular brightness in a face when something that was confusing became suddenly clear. She liked the organizational challenge of it, the problem of 32 different people with 32 different rates of understanding and 32 different reasons why a given lesson might or might not land. What she had not liked increasingly was the rest of it. The rest of it was a school board that cared considerably more about the cost of chalk than about whether the children could read. The rest of it was a salary that had not changed in 4 years, despite inflation that had changed everything else. The rest of it was the particular quality of solitude that comes from being 26 and unmarried in a city where the social structures available to unmarried women of her class and circumstance were limited in ways she had begun to find suffocating. She had answered the advertisement in October. She had seen it in the Tribune on a Tuesday morning and read it twice and cut it out and put it in her coat pocket, which was not something she did with advertisements as a general rule. She read it again that evening and then wrote a response that was measured and informative and entirely honest about her situation and qualifications, because she had decided that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it without pretense. The man who responded was named Franklin Deese. He had property in Wyoming territory, a house, a small but viable cattle operation, and what he described as a need for a sensible partner who would not find the isolation distressing. His letters were neat and direct. He did not make elaborate promises. He mentioned the mountains 3 times across 6 letters, always in the same way: they are very large and they are very quiet, as though this were the primary recommendation he wished to make on behalf of his situation. She had thought, I can work with large and quiet. She had given notice at Moorfield Elementary in November. She had packed her trunks, said goodbye to the 2 colleagues who had constituted her social world in Chicago, written to the Westward Venture matrimonial agency to confirm her travel arrangements, and gotten on the train in December with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, 6 books, 3 months' teaching wages in an envelope inside her coat, and the practical expectations of a woman who had read enough about frontier marriage arrangements to understand that the first year was typically the hardest. She had not expected no one to be on the platform. The station at Greystone Pass was a low wooden building with a covered platform on either side and a painted sign above the door that had been white once and was now the color of everything that spends several winters at altitude. The station master was a broad-shouldered man in a sheepskin coat whose name she would learn later was Arvin Holt, and he had been managing this station for 11 years and had seen enough arriving mail-order brides to have developed a particular expression for the specific moment when the woman steps off the train and looks at the platform and understands that no one is there. He was doing that expression now. "Expecting someone?" he asked. "A Mr. Franklin Deese," she said. "He arranged for a wagon to meet me." Holt looked at the empty platform. He looked at the empty road leading into town. He looked at Iris with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to say the obvious thing too quickly. "Stage came through yesterday," he said. "Nothing on the board for Deese." He knew my arrival date. I wrote twice to confirm it. "Yes, ma'am." He picked up one of her trunks and carried it under the platform overhang out of the wind. "That's the date we're on." She stood very still for a moment and let the information settle. The wind coming off of the mountains was the kind of cold that does not arrive all at once, but enters through every seam, every gap between collar and skin, every breath you draw in. Her wool coat had been adequate for Chicago in December. It was not adequate for this. The sky above the peaks to the north was already darkening in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Is there an inn?" she asked. "Hotel Greystone on the main road, $2 a night." He paused. "Telegraph office is next door if you need to send word." She looked at her two trunks under the overhang and did the arithmetic of $2 a night against the 3 months' wages in her coat and the 4 to 6 days it would take for a telegraph response from Chicago in the advancing storm visible above the mountains, and whatever it would cost to arrange alternate transportation once she had received said response and arrived at a number that was smaller than she would have liked. "Could you watch these for a few minutes?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," he said with the air of a man who was glad to have something useful to do. She walked to the edge of the platform and looked at the mountains. They were going away. The cloud cover was moving over them from the north, and the peaks were disappearing one by one into the darkening sky as the storm came down, and what remained visible was only the lower slopes and the dark mass of the pine forests and the long white valley floor stretching between her and whatever was up there. The smell of the air was pine and altitude and coming snow, and something she had no name for yet. A quality of cold that was different in kind from winter in Chicago, less aggressive somehow, more matter-of-fact, as though the cold here did not have anything to prove. She was frightened. She was also underneath the fear mixed with it, and distinct from it simultaneously, something she would not have a name for until later. She was interested. The mountains even disappearing had a presence she had not felt before from any landscape. They made the world feel very large and very specific at the same time. They did not require her to have an opinion about them. They had been here for a very long time, and they would continue being here, and the fact of her standing on this platform, looking at them, was too small to change any of that. She found to her considerable surprise that this was comforting. She turned to go back to her trunks and stopped. There was a man at the far end of the platform. He had not been there when the train pulled in. She was certain of this, the way you are certain of negative space. She had registered the emptiness of the platform when she stepped off, and this figure was not part of that emptiness. And yet here he was standing at the far edge of the overhang where the lamplight gave out, not moving, watching her. The distance and the light made it difficult to read him in detail, but the size of him was immediately apparent. Not merely tall, but built in a way that suggested a working life in unforgiving conditions. Broad shoulders, a solidity that went beyond simple largeness. The kind of physical presence that develops over many years of doing things that require the full engagement of a body. He wore a heavy canvas coat that had been dark at some point and was now the color of things that had been weathered. His hat was pulled low against the wind. He was watching her with the stillness of an animal or a person trained to patience by long practice. She met his gaze across the platform. She had been meeting men's gazes directly for long enough that she did it without thinking about it, though she knew it unsettled some of them. He did not seem unsettled. He looked at her, looking at him for a moment, and then he walked toward her. He was older than she had initially supposed from the distance, mid-40s, she thought, or had been worked into looking it. His face was the face of a man who had spent a great deal of time in weather-deep lines at the corners of his eyes, skin that had been tanned and tanned again over many seasons. His eyes, when he came close enough for her to see them, were a pale, clear gray, the gray of Wyoming sky in late autumn, before it has decided what kind of day it intends to be. There was a scar on the left side of his face, a long scar, old and settled, running from the line of his jaw upward past his cheekbone and disappearing into the shadow of his hat brim. It was the kind of scar that had been a serious injury once and was now simply part of the face it inhabited. He stopped at what she would have characterized as a respectful distance, far enough to not crowd her close enough to speak without raising his voice against the wind, and looked at her for a moment before he said anything. "The Dease property is empty," he said. "Has been since September." She held his gaze. "Explain that." He explained it flatly without softening. Franklin Dease had sold his cattle in September and left the territory, and had not left a forwarding address at the Territorial Records Office or at the post. No one seemed to know his destination. There had been some discussion in town about what he owed to various people and whether he had settled those debts before he left. The general sense was that he had not. She listened to this without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "And you knew this." "I come into Greystone Pass every 2 weeks or so for supplies. I heard at Birch's store that a woman had been sending letters to the Dease place, and no one was receiving them. Arvin Holt mentioned a date when he'd been asked to watch for an arrival." He paused. The date was today. She looked at him for a moment. "So you came to the station?" "Yes." "Why?" He appeared to consider this as a legitimate question deserving a considered answer. "Because leaving a woman stranded on a December platform in Wyoming territory with a storm coming is not a thing I'm willing to stand by and watch." It was said without ceremony, without any of the inflection that would have made it into something intended to impress her. He said it the way he said everything, as a statement of fact about a decision that had been made and the reason for it. She found that she responded to this. Sentiment would have made her feel small. This made her feel as though she was being spoken to by one adult explaining a decision to another adult who deserved the explanation. "What were you planning to do about it?" she asked. He explained. He had a cabin 11 miles into the mountains, heated weather-tight with a spare room. The storm coming down from the Absaroka tonight would make the hotel road impassable by 8 o'clock. The temperature would drop fast after dark, and the new snow would set over the ice that had been accumulating since last week. She could stay at the hotel and hope the storm broke in a day or two, which it might or might not, or she could come with him now while the road was still open. Or, she said, I could send a telegraph tonight and wait for a response. You could do that. 4 to 6 days for a response minimum, assuming no delays in the lines. The storm is forecast to last 2 days. He looked at the northern sky. There is a second system behind it. This is not a good month to be waiting on a train platform. She thought about what she knew of Wyoming winter. She thought about the 3 months' wages. She thought about what 4 to 6 days at $2 a night did to 3 months' wages. "I don't know your name," she said. "Caden Harrow." "Iris Colby." She held out her hand, and he shook it once firmly and released it. His hand was very large and calloused in the specific places that long use of particular tools produces. "Mr. Harrow, do you make a habit of this?" "No," he said. "This is the first time." "Do you anticipate making a habit of it?" "No." The corners of his eyes moved very slightly. "I don't anticipate that it will come up again." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked at Arvin Holt, who had been standing at a careful distance during this exchange, and who, when she caught his eye, gave her a small nod. Not emphatic, just the nod of a man who had known the person she was talking to for long enough to have formed an opinion, and the opinion was one he was comfortable expressing in a nod. "The heavier trunk has the books in it," she said. "The books are the most important thing in either trunk. Can your horses manage both?" He almost did something with his face. Not quite a smile, the structure of one. "I have 2 horses," he said. The road into the mountains was not a road in any Chicago sense of the word. It was a packed trail through snow and pine and frozen ground, wide enough in summer for a wagon and sufficient in December for 2 horses ridden in single file, and it climbed at angles that would have been difficult in daylight and were demanding in the dark. The dark came fast. By the time they left Greystone Pass, the road had entered the trees, and the lamplight of the town was behind them, and there was nothing ahead but the movement of Caden Harrow on the horse in front of her, and the sound of hooves and wind in the pines, and the particular quality of cold that lives inside a mountain forest at night in December. She had ridden before, not extensively and not on mountain horses in the dark in a blizzard, but she had enough basic familiarity that she could sit in the saddle and hold the reins without getting in the bay mare's way. The mare seemed to regard this as sufficient qualification and picked her way along the trail with the confident, unhurried competence of an animal that had made this trip in worse conditions and expected to make it many more times. The cold stopped being something she felt in degrees and became simply the ambient condition of the world. She rode and breathed and watched the dark shape of Caden Harrow moving ahead of her through the pine shadows and thought about what she had done. She had gotten on a horse with a stranger in the dark in a Wyoming blizzard and ridden into the mountains. She had done this because Arvin Holt had nodded and because the arithmetic of $2 a night in a hotel against the coming storm had produced an answer that made staying in town a worse risk than going with a man who had come to a train station specifically to keep her from freezing on a platform. She had done it because she had looked at Caden Harrow's face and seen something in it. Not warmth exactly, warmth was the wrong word for him, but something she trusted, which was the same thing in practice, if not in vocabulary. The fact that he had stated his decision plainly and given her the information she needed to evaluate it, and then waited for her to decide without guiding or persuading or touching her arm, that was the thing she had trusted. She trusted people who let her decide. They had been riding for perhaps 40 minutes when she noticed the third horse. He had mentioned 2 horses. She had registered this, the horse he rode, and the pack horse carrying her heavier trunk. But in the last several minutes, a third presence had entered the edge of her awareness, a shape moving through the trees to the left of the trail parallel to them, keeping pace. She could not see it clearly in the dark and the falling snow. Just a pale suggestion between the pines, deliberate, careful pace, exactly to match their movement. She watched it for several minutes and then looked down at the ground below it, when a gap in the forest let in enough ambient light to read the snow. Small boot prints, the size of a child's foot. She watched the small figure in the trees, and she watched the angle of Caden Harrow's head on the horse ahead of her, and she saw it a brief shift, just a turn of his head to the left, the kind of involuntary check a person makes when they are monitoring something they already know is there. He had not mentioned it. He had not looked over his shoulder to see if she had noticed. He had simply checked and returned his gaze to the trail ahead. He had a child with him, a child he had not mentioned. She said nothing. The cold forest moved around her, and the small figure kept pace in the trees, and she filed what she had seen in the particular interior drawer she kept for things that required more information before she could properly respond to them. It was a useful drawer. She had developed it over 4 years of managing 32 children who were frequently in possession of information they were not telling her. The cabin appeared out of the trees like something solid that the storm had been keeping hidden. Low, wide, built into the hillside with stone walls on the lower half and heavy timbers above a chimney, producing visible gray smoke against the black sky, a lamp burning in the single front window. A covered porch with cordwood stacked from floor to soffit on 3 sides. A barn shape off to the right, dark, the horses presumably already inside and settled. It looked, she thought, like a place that had been built to last. Caden helped her down from the mare. She permitted this, because the cold had removed significant precision from her hands and took the horses around to the barn, and she stood on the porch in the wind and snow and looked at the door. And the door opened from the inside. A child stood in the doorway. 9 years old, perhaps, small for her age, with dark hair cut straight across at her chin and dark eyes that moved from the empty porch to Iris, with an expression that was neither fear nor welcome exactly, but something more precise than either. Curiosity. The direct, unfiltered curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to moderate her interest in things. She had a sketchbook pressed against her chest with both arms, the way people hold things they do not want to put down. She looked at Iris for a moment, and then she said in a voice that was matter-of-fact and entirely unself-conscious, "He said he might bring someone back. I didn't think he actually would." Behind Iris, boots on the porch steps. Pearl. Caden's voice, even not reproof, but not reproof, either the voice of a man who had made a decision and was still in the process of understanding the consequences of it. The child Pearl looked at Caden and then back at Iris, apparently cross-referencing something. "You can come inside," Pearl said. "It's warmer." Iris looked at Caden Harrow. He was standing at the top of the porch steps with snow on the brim of his hat and on his shoulders, and his face was doing the thing it apparently did when it was waiting to see how something was going to go. She read it better than she expected to for having known him for only a few hours. "You didn't mention," she said quietly, "that there was someone here." "No," he said. "I didn't." A silence in which the wind said something unintelligible through the pines, and the fire inside the cabin made its small, steady noise through the open door. "We should get inside," he said. "The temperature's dropping." She looked at the child in the doorway, Pearl with her dark eyes and her sketchbook, and her calm, curious face. And she looked at the lamp burning behind her, and she looked at the warmth and the shelter, and the simple fact of an alternative to standing on a frozen porch. She looked at Caden Harrow and thought, there is more to this than I've been told. There is considerably more. "Yes," she said. "Let's get inside." She stepped through the door. Pearl stepped back to make room for her, watching with that steady cataloging attention. Then Pearl looked at Caden over Iris's shoulder. Caden looked back. Something passed between them that Iris had not yet been in this family long enough to read. She would learn to read it. She would learn over the months ahead to read most things about this cabin and the people in it. But on this first night, she simply stood in the warmth of the fire and felt the cold beginning to leave her hands and thought, whatever is here, there is more of it than I was told. And decided in the particular way she made decisions quickly, practically, with all available information factored in, that this was interesting and not frightening, and that she intended to find out what it was. Gata. The first morning in the cabin, Iris woke before anyone else. She lay in the spare room for a moment and listened to the structure around her settling, and working in the cold, the sound of the fire in the main room doing its job, the distant muffled quality of wind over a heavy snowfall. The room was small and clean. A quilt on the bed that had been made by careful hands, the squares cut even and the stitching tight. A washstand with a china basin and pitcher, the pitcher full of water that had gone icy overnight. A coat hook on the wall. A single window showing nothing but the gray-white of pre-dawn and the shapes of the nearest pines blurred by the snow on the glass. She had slept better than the circumstances warranted. She dressed in the dark, which she was practiced at 4 years of early morning classroom preparations, had given her the ability to accomplish most morning tasks by feel and muscle memory, and came out into the main room. The fire had been built up before anyone had gone to sleep, and the main room held its warmth in the particular way of rooms built to hold it, the heat staying low and steady rather than surging and falling. There was a table with 4 chairs, 2 of which showed regular use, and 2 of which were clearly ceremonial in the way of furniture purchased for a household that had never been large enough to need it. A long kitchen counter with a good iron stove, shelves of carefully organized supplies, a workbench in the corner with tools racked above it in the specific order of a person who valued particular things being in their particular places. Pearl Harrow was already awake. She sat at the table nearest the fire with her sketchbook open and a stub of pencil in her hand and a small oil lamp pulled close, drawing with the focused concentration of a person doing something necessary. She did not startle when Iris came in, which meant she had heard Iris moving in the spare room and had known she was coming. She looked up briefly. "You wake up early," Pearl said. "Always have. 4 years of 6 o'clock classrooms." Iris went to the stove and assessed the supply situation. "What are you drawing?" Pearl turned the sketchbook without breaking her work. It was the cabin's front window, the one Iris had looked at last night before she'd fallen asleep. In the drawing, the storm outside had been rendered in dozens of short, careful lines, distinct in direction and pressure from one another, so that the snowfall looked like snowfall rather than simply texture. The lamp's reflection was there in the glass. And in the glass reflected a figure standing in the doorway of the spare room, Iris recognizable by the shape of her hair, looking out at the storm. Pearl had drawn her looking out at the storm. Iris looked at the drawing for a long moment. The technique was extraordinary for 9 years old. The observation even more so. "That's very good," she said. "I know," Pearl said, and turned the book back to continue. Iris was not offended by this. She had known many children who had not yet acquired the habit of false modesty, who had assessed a piece of their own work honestly and reported the assessment directly. And she had always liked these children better than the ones who had been trained to say, "Oh, it's nothing. It's just a little thing." Pearl had looked at what she'd drawn and found it accurate and said so. This seemed to Iris like a good way to be. She started breakfast. She found the root cellar under a hinged door near the hearth, 2 steps down into a cold, low-ceilinged space lined with shelves, precisely organized potatoes. 3 varieties of hard root vegetables she identified by feel and smell. A crock of butter, 2 dozen eggs packed in sawdust, a hanging haunch of cured pork, dried herbs, and labeled paper packets. She came back up with eggs and potatoes and the beginning of a sense of what this household was built on, which was efficiency and care, applied in equal measure to every practical problem. By the time Caden came out of the back, there were two doors off the main room. One he'd come from, and one that must be Pearl's. The bacon from a cut she'd found was crackling in the skillet, and the coffee was on, and a pan of corn cake was in the oven. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the stove, and then at her with an expression she was beginning to read the edges of. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know. I was cold and I needed something to do with my hands." She looked at him. "What does Pearl drink in the morning?" "Warm milk when I have it, water otherwise." "Is there milk?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he put his coat on and went out. He came back 20 minutes later with a tin pail of fresh milk and snow on his shoulders. He set the pail on the counter without comment and shed his coat and sat down across from Pearl, who had put her sketchbook away and was waiting for breakfast with the patient propriety of a child who has been taught table manners and has chosen to apply them. They ate together, which Iris gathered from various small signals was not the usual shape of breakfast at this table. Caden ate quickly and without comment, moving through the food with the focused efficiency of a man who thinks of eating primarily as a functional requirement. Pearl ate more slowly and watched Iris eat, and then said with the directness that seemed to be her primary mode, "You made this better than he does." "Pearl," Caden said. "It's accurate," Pearl said with the composure of someone reporting an objective condition. "You burned it the last 4 times. I didn't burn it the third time. It was brown on the bottom. That's different from burned. It tasted burned." Iris kept her expression very carefully neutral and poured more coffee. Outside, the wind was still working at the eaves. Inside, the stove clicked as the metal expanded with the heat, and the fire spoke quietly to itself. And Pearl ate her corn cake in small, precise bites and showed no signs of being anything other than exactly who she was. The storm lasted 2 full days. On the first day, while Caden went out periodically to check the horses and assess the depth of the accumulation, Iris stayed inside with Pearl and learned the child's situation through the method she had found most reliable with children. Ask simple questions and listen carefully to everything around the edges of the answers. Pearl had lived in the cabin for 4 years. She knew this because Caden had explained to her that she was 5 when they came here, and she was now 9. Before the cabin, there had been a place further down in the valley near a town. She did not remember the town well. She remembered a particular orange cat that had lived under a neighbor's porch. She remembered that her grandfather had smelled of wood shavings and that her father had sometimes sung when he worked, which Caden did not. She did not remember the names of anyone other than her grandfather and her father and Caden, who was not her grandfather or her father, but who was the adult responsible for her, which she had worked out independently at some point and seemed to find an adequate arrangement. She did not remember her mother at all. Her mother, she explained matter-of-factly, had died when Pearl was too young. She had seen a photograph of her mother once in a box of things Caden kept, and she had drawn it from memory. "May I see?" Iris asked. Pearl found the page. A woman's face sketched from a small photograph, which meant some detail was estimated rather than observed, but the essential quality of it, dark eyes, a particular set to the jaw that Iris recognized as inherited, was clearly there. "She looked like you," Iris said. "Caden says that too," Pearl said. She closed the sketchbook. "He says I have her eyes." She said it without particular emotion, which was not the absence of emotion, but the presence of a child who has been living with a fact for so long that it has become simply part of the landscape, neither sharp nor dull anymore. Just there. Iris had seen this in children before. It was in its way a form of resilience. Not the performed resilience of someone who has decided not to be sad, but the organic resilience of someone who has found a way to incorporate the hard thing into the rest of living. They did lessons on the second day. Iris had the books from the heavy trunk which Caden had brought in from the barn. She spread them on the table and let Pearl look at them and make selections, and Pearl picked up the natural history book first and looked at the illustration on the cover, a cross-section of a canyon wall, the geological layers labeled with the expression of a scientist who has just encountered unexpectedly relevant data. "This is about rocks," Pearl said, "and plants and animals and weather. It's about the natural world." "I draw those things," Pearl said. "I know. That's why I thought you'd like it." Pearl opened to the table of contents and ran her finger down it, and found the chapter on mountain ecosystems and opened to that first, which was not the beginning, but was apparently the beginning that mattered to Pearl. She read it with the focused, still attention of someone for whom reading was not a social activity, but a private one, a direct line between the text and her own thoughts that required very little management. After an hour, she looked up. "I can borrow this." "You can have it," Iris said. "I have two more on the same shelf at school." Pearl looked at her. "You don't have a school here." "Not yet," Iris said. Pearl considered this. Then she went back to reading. Reading lessons in the morning, arithmetic in the afternoon. Pearl had more facility with both than her limited formal education should have produced, which told Iris that she was either naturally quick or had been working at things independently, or both. She showed Pearl the column method for arithmetic, which Pearl grasped in the time it took to demonstrate it, and then immediately applied to an inventory of the root cellar, which she apparently conducted periodically and had been doing in her head. Seeing it written down produced in her the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just set it down. "So, if we have 47 pounds of potatoes," Pearl said, pencil moving, "and we use approximately 3 pounds a week, that's 15 weeks and 2 days. Yes, that's spring." She looked at the figure. "That's enough." "More than enough," Iris said. "And there are 2 more varieties in the cellar besides the main potato." Pearl nodded with the satisfaction of confirmed arithmetic. Then she said, without looking up from the paper, "Why did you come here?" Iris considered how to answer this. She had found that children, as a rule, did not appreciate receiving the edited version of an answer when they had asked for the real one. They frequently could tell the difference, and when they couldn't, it established the wrong kind of relationship. "I answered an advertisement," she said. "A man in Wyoming territory was looking for a wife. I corresponded with him and agreed to come. When I arrived at the station, he wasn't there." She paused. "No one was there." Pearl looked up. "And then Caden was there." "Yes." "He does that," Pearl said. "He doesn't ignore things he thinks are wrong." She said it matter-of-factly as a character observation, the way she might have described the cat from her early childhood, even when it would be easier to. She looked back at her arithmetic. "He didn't have to come get me either. Nobody asked him to. But he did." Iris looked at this 9-year-old child sitting at the table with her pencil and her arithmetic and her matter-of-fact account of the man who had taken her in, and thought, you understand him considerably better than most people would who had known him 4 times as long. "He's lucky to have you," Iris said. Pearl looked up. "I know," she said, not boasting, the same tone as the drawing, an honest assessment of a real condition. Iris almost smiled. "You're also lucky to have him." "I know that too," Pearl said. The storm broke on the morning of the 3rd day. The sky came clear all at once, hard and bright, and so blue after 2 days of gray that the color seemed implausible. The snow sat 3 feet deep in the valley, and the pines were loaded with it, and the mountains revealed themselves for the first time since Iris had arrived in Wyoming territory. She stood on the porch and looked at them. She had grown up near Lake Erie, where the horizon is water and the sky is simply sky. She had spent 4 years in Chicago, where the horizon is buildings and the sky is usually approximately gray. She had seen mountain ranges from train windows, the view compressed and managed by glass and movement. This was different from all of those things in a way she had no existing vocabulary for. The Absaroka Range in December, showing itself after 2 days of hiding, filled the entire northern horizon with something that did not require her to have an opinion about it. White peaks and dark timber in the long fall of the slopes down to the valley floor, and above it all, a sky of the kind of blue that you see in expensive paintings that you generally assume is an exaggeration. She stood there long enough that her hands got cold in her gloves. Caden came out of the barn and crossed the yard and came up the porch steps and stood beside her. Not close. A respectful distance, the distance he maintained by default, enough space that her being there was her own and not encroached upon. "Will you want me to take you back to Greystone Pass today?" he asked. She considered the question seriously. She considered the hotel and the telegraph and the 3 months' wages and the 4 to 6 days and the second storm he had mentioned following behind this one. She considered Pearl at the breakfast table this morning, the natural history book open beside her plate, reading between bites. She considered what Pearl had said about arithmetic and the root cellar. "What is Pearl doing for schooling?" she asked. "I teach her what I know, numbers, some reading. Not as much as she should have. A pause. I'm not a teacher. I am. She looked at the mountains. She's intelligent. She's behind where she should be for her age, not by much, but behind. She needs more than what's available here. She turned to look at him. And I have nowhere else to be. He looked at the mountains also. I can't pay teachers' wages. I don't need wages. I need room and board while I sort out what to do next. I'm not built for sitting still, and I'm not going to sit in a hotel in Greystone Pass doing nothing while I wait for correspondence from Chicago. She paused. I can be useful here, if you're willing to consider that. He was quiet for a long time. The morning light was doing things to the snow that she didn't have names for. Yet the particular way light and cold and crystal worked together at altitude, and the pines were dripping where the surface snow was beginning to release. The situation here, he said carefully, is not simple. I'd gathered that, she said. When you're ready to explain it, I'll listen. Until then, I'll teach Pearl and try not to burn the corn cake. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite amusement. The acknowledgement that amusement was possible in the vicinity of what she'd said. The corn cake is harder than it looks at this altitude, he said. I'll manage, she said, and went back inside. The days took on shape. Morning lessons at the table reading first, because Pearl was hungry for text in the specific way of a mind that has been given some but not enough and is aware of the gap. Iris set her the primer first, which Pearl moved through in 4 days and set aside without ceremony, ready for the next thing. The natural history book occupied her for 2 weeks in a steady, focused way. She read it the way scientists read, stopping to verify things she'd already observed against the descriptions on the page, making notations in her sketchbook, occasionally going outside to check something specific and coming back in with snow on her boots and a confirmed hypothesis. The history of the Western Territories she read with a different quality of attention. This was not the attention of a researcher, but the attention of a person encountering information that clarifies something personal and has no adult present to ask follow-up questions of. She read certain chapters twice. She read the chapter on territorial land law 3 times and then closed the book and sat with it closed for a while before she said anything. What's a land claim, she asked. It's a registered piece of property, Iris said. The territorial government keeps records of who owns what land and the boundaries of each piece. And if someone has one, it's theirs. If it's registered correctly and the claim is valid, yes. Pearl opened the book again. What if someone changes the records? Iris looked at her. Why do you ask? I just want to know, Pearl said, and went back to reading. Arithmetic led to practical mathematics. Pearl was already running mental inventory of the entire cabin's supplies, Iris discovered with a precision that suggested she'd been doing it since she was old enough to understand numbers at all. Iris showed her how to write the calculations down, how to project forward by week and month, how to build the kind of ledger that made the numbers accessible to someone other than the person carrying them in their head. Pearl took to this immediately and produced within 3 days a handwritten inventory of the root cellar, the woodpile, the barn supplies, and the kitchen pantry with projected consumption rates and estimated adequacy dates. She showed it to Caden at dinner. He read it carefully. The firewood's short, he said. I'll cut more this week. I estimated low on the firewood because I wasn't sure how much we use in a cold week versus a mild week, Pearl said. The actual number is probably somewhere between the 2 columns. It's closer to the cold week column, he said. Then we should add 15%, Pearl said. He looked at Iris over Pearl's head with an expression that was not quite what she would have called impressed, but was in the same general territory. She's been doing this in her head for years, Iris said mildly. I just gave her paper. He looked at Pearl's ledger for another moment. Good, Tom. He said in the tone that she was learning was his version of considerable approval. Pearl filed this information and went back to her arithmetic. On a Sunday in the 4th week of this arrangement, while Caden was at the workbench and Pearl was reading and Iris was teaching Pearl at the table, the chapter on Western territorial history that covered mineral rights and land grant law, she found the survey folio. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for the extra blanket that Caden had mentioned on the 2nd day. The spare room's north wall lost heat faster than the rest of the cabin, and the nights had been getting colder rather than warmer. She'd moved the wooden chest at the foot of the bed to check whether the blanket might be stored behind it, and the chest had shifted and revealed in the gap between its back and the floorboards a leather portfolio, flat and wide and old with a cord tied around it. She did not open it. She stood there holding it for a moment. It was heavier than it looked, the leather stiff with age and use, and then she put it back exactly where it had been pushed. The chest back into position, found the extra blanket in the wardrobe she hadn't tried yet, and went back out to the main room. She said nothing about it. But she thought about it. Her father had been a county property surveyor for 20 years, which meant she had grown up with the visual and tactile vocabulary of survey documents, their particular heavy paper, the specific smell of old ink and official seals, the way the dimensions and notations were arranged. A survey portfolio was not a personal document. It was a legal document or connected to legal documents, the kind of thing that mattered in official processes. The kind of thing you kept hidden when its contents were dangerous. She thought about Pearl's careful question about land claims. She thought about the town further down in the valley that Pearl had lived in before, near a mine that Pearl mentioned once when she was reading the natural history chapter on mineral formation. She thought about Caden Harrow, who had not been to Greystone Pass in 3 years, who maintained the particular vigilance of someone living under a condition they have not named out loud to the people around them. There was a story here that she had not been told. She was still thinking about it when in the 5th week, a horse appeared on the trail. It was a Monday morning. Pearl was at the table doing the history chapter that covered territorial law. Caden was at the workbench with a length of harness leather and an awl. Iris was at the counter putting together the midday meal. They heard the horse at different moments, Caden first, who went still in the way of an animal registering an unexpected sound, and then Iris, who heard the change in his stillness before she heard the horse itself, and then Pearl, who looked up from her book and looked at Caden and then at Iris. Caden was at the window before any of them spoke. He looked at whatever was on the trail for a fraction of a second. Then Pearl, go to your room. Pearl's face registered the same thing Iris registered. This was not the go to your room of ordinary parental authority. This was something else. Now, Caden said. Pearl went. She went quickly and without argument, which told Iris everything she needed to know about how often Pearl had heard Caden use that specific tone. Pearl's door closed not all the way. A crack left the crack of a child who intended to listen and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Iris stayed at the counter and looked at Caden. He came back from the window. His face was doing a kind of controlled stillness that she understood now as the equivalent for him of a significant reaction in another person. Who is it? She said. Aldous Crane, he said, the territorial land commissioner. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, I'll answer the door. He looked at her sharply. You answering your own door raises questions, she said, keeping her voice very level. A woman at the door of a mountain cabin raises different questions, and different questions are better than the right ones right now. She paused. Unless you think he already knows. He thought about this for a fraction of a second. Go ahead, he said. She went to the door and opened it. The man on the porch was well dressed in the way of men who live in territories, but wished to signal they are not of them. A good wool coat with city tailoring, leather gloves that had not been worn for hard work. A horse at the rail behind him that was expensive and groomed in a way that the working horses she'd seen were not. He had an even-featured face that had been good-looking once and had moved into the kind of middle-aged presentation that comes from having spent decades arranging it for best effect. Gray at the temples, brown eyes that moved across her face with a professional quickness, assessing and sorting before they had finished the motions of greeting. Good afternoon, he said. His voice was smooth and well-pitched, the voice of someone practiced at rooms. I'm looking for Caden Harrow. Is this his property? It is, Iris said. And you are Aldous Crane. I'm the territorial land commissioner. A brief professional smile. And you would be Iris Colby. She gave him nothing further than the name. Miss Colby, is Mr. Harrow at home? He is, she said. Is he expecting you? I don't believe so. Routine administrative business property records, census update. Nothing that need concern you. She held the door and did not step back to widen the opening. He glanced past her. Just once, just briefly, the practiced glance of someone cataloging a room. His gaze moved from the main room to the counter, to the table, to the 2 doors off the back of the room. It stopped for less than a second on Pearl's door. Pearl's door, which was not quite closed. Then Caden was at her shoulder. She heard him cross the room behind her, and Crane looked up and encountered the full reality of Caden Harrow's height and build, and the particular quality of his attention. And Iris saw in the fraction of a second before his professional composure receded itself. Something moved through his face. He knew. She was not certain what he knew specifically, whether he had known about Pearl before today, or whether the glance at Pearl's door had told him something he had suspected, but he knew something. The professional smile came back without hesitation, but she had seen the moment before it, and the moment before it had contained something that looked very much like a man rapidly recalibrating. "Mr. Harrow," Crane said pleasantly, "I won't take much of your time." Caden stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door partly closed behind him. He managed this without making the closing of the door seem like a statement, which it was just a man coming out to speak with a caller, as men in mountain cabins do, the door most of the way shut against the cold. Iris remained in the main room. She did not move to the window because moving to the window would be seen, and she did not want to be seen. She stood near the counter and listened. Their voices carried through the door in fragments layered over the sound of the wind working along the porch eaves. Crane's voice was smooth and even, a voice accustomed to carrying weight without raising volume. Census records, update property registry, routine administrative follow-up. Nothing onerous. Caden's voice was what it always was, flat direct, each word placed where it needed to be, and nowhere else property's been in my name, 9 years occupied by me, no other residents. A pause, then Crane. "Of course, and any guests from time to time, Caden." "I don't have guests." Another pause, the creak of porch boards, a horse being untied. "Crane, we may have follow-up questions over the coming weeks. I trust you'll be available." "Caden, I'm here most of the time." Then very clearly aimed at the door in a way that made it obvious it was aimed at the door. "Good day, Mr. Harrow, and to Miss Colby if she can hear me." Iris stood with her hands at her sides and considered what that sentence was and what it was for. It was a demonstration not of anger or threat, nothing so unrefined, but of information. He wanted them to know that he was aware of the arrangement in the cabin. He wanted them to know that he was aware she had been listening. He was telling them in the register of a man for whom power has long since become simply the ambient condition of things, that this visit had established what it needed to establish, and that further visits would be made as he saw fit. She heard Caden come back inside. He stood with his back against the door and looked at her. His face was doing the careful compressed thing it did when there was a significant amount happening inside it that he had decided not to release immediately. "Pearl," he said. Pearl came out of her room. She had been listening. Iris knew she had probably heard more of the conversation than Iris had given, that her room was at the back of the cabin, and sound traveled differently there. Pearl came out with her sketchbook against her chest, and her face arranged in the particular composure that Iris had come to recognize as Pearl's version of bracing herself. The three of them stood in the main room. Outside, the horse's hoofbeats moved away down the trail, deliberate and unhurried. Caden looked at his hands. He looked at the table. He looked at the fire. Then he looked at Iris. "Sit down," he said. "Both of you." They sat. He stayed standing near the door with the particular quality of a man who has been deciding something for a very long time and has finally arrived at the decision. It was, she thought, the most human she had seen him look. "There are things I'm going to tell you," he said to Iris. His voice was level, but she was learning to read the texture beneath the level. "You'll be able to decide what you want to do after I've told you. That's your right. I won't argue with whatever you decide." He turned his gaze to Pearl. "And you're old enough to hear this. I should have told you more of it before now." Pearl looked at him with those clear, steady eyes and didn't move. He sat down. Not in his usual way, not with the efficiency of a man completing a functional task. He turned a chair around and sat in it, backward, arms across the back, which was the only relaxed posture she had ever seen him take, and somehow made him look more, rather than less, guarded. "Her name was Reeve before it was Harrow," he said. "Her grandfather was Thomas Reeve. Her father was Joseph Reeve." He said it in the same flat tone he used for everything, but she had learned to hear what the flat tone was protecting. "Thomas and I came into this territory together. 1868. We surveyed the Hollow Creek Basin in 69, 2 men and a compass, and 6 months of hard work. We filed the original land claims together, Reeve property, my property. We knew that land as well as men can know a piece of ground. We'd walked every foot of it." He stopped for a moment. "He was my closest friend," he said. 20 years. I stood at his wedding. He stood at mine." Pearl was utterly still. Thomas's wife died in 1874, he continued. My wife had died the year before same fever. Thomas had Joseph by then, who was 6. I had no children. He paused on that for just a moment, the weight of it visible. We looked out for each other's families after that, the way you do. He looked at Pearl. Your father grew up in Hollow Creek, Joseph. He was a good man. He looked like Thomas, same build, same way of thinking things through before he spoke. Something moved in his face and settled. He was 26 when he died. You were 5. Pearl made a very small sound, not quite a word, not one. I want to tell you the whole thing, Caden said. All of it. You're old enough. He looked at her steadily. Thomas filed his land claim on the Hollow Creek Basin in 1869, signed by both of us as co-surveyors. The claim was on record at the Territorial Recorder's Office for 8 years without any dispute. The property included the Reeve homestead and the hillside above the East Creek, which we'd mapped as showing mineral deposits. Not enormous, but enough to be worth knowing about. Mining, Pearl said. Potential for it. In 1877, a man named Aldous Crane came into the territory as the new land commissioner. He was effective. He had a particular talent for finding survey claims with exploitable irregularities, and when there weren't irregularities, he was capable of producing them. Caden's voice stayed level, but there was something behind it now. Not anger, exactly the thing that is further down than anger and quieter. In the fall of 1877, a new set of survey documents appeared in the Territorial Records Office, showing different boundaries on the Reeve claim. A line that had run one place in 1869 now ran a quarter-mile east of where Thomas and I had put it, which moved the mineral-bearing hillside out of the Reeve parcel and into a parcel belonging to someone associated with Crane, Iris said. An associate who had filed a quiet registration on that parcel 6 months earlier. He looked at the table. Thomas saw the new documents in November of 1877. He came to me immediately. We both knew what it was we'd surveyed that ground ourselves. We'd set those boundary markers. We knew exactly where the line ran. We spent the winter of 1877 and the early months of 1878 building a case. Original survey records, field notes, witness testimony from the men who'd worked the claim with us. What happened? Pearl asked. Her voice was very quiet. In March of 1878, a mine shaft collapsed in the Hollow Creek Basin, on the hillside that Crane's associate had been developing. He stopped. The collapse killed 4 men. Thomas was down in the shaft that morning. He'd gone to check the survey stakes because he was still trying to prove the boundary fraud. Joseph was with him. He stopped again. The fire said nothing useful. Pearl was with the neighbor woman that day, the one with the cat. She had not known that. Iris could see from Pearl's face that she had not known that she had understood that her grandfather and father were gone, but not the specific shape of how they'd gone. Pearl sat with this for a long moment. Then she said in a voice that was entirely steady, they were trying to prove it. Yes. And they died doing it. Yes. Pearl opened her sketchbook. She did not draw anything. She just had it open in front of her, the way some people hold a book they are not reading just to have something to put their hands on. The inquiry afterward was conducted by Crane's office, Caden said. The findings were equipment failure. The original survey dispute was not entered into the record. The case was closed. His jaw moved just slightly. Pearl was 5. Her mother had been gone 2 years. There was no family that I could find. I was Thomas's partner, and I was the only person who knew everything that had happened. I took her, and I came here. And you kept the documents, Iris said. I had Thomas's copies of the original survey work. He'd kept them at the homestead, and I retrieved them before Crane's people could get to the property. I've been collecting additional documentation since then, field notes, correspondence, anything I could find through contacts at the Territorial Records Office, who were willing to help quietly. He paused. They're in this cabin. Iris thought of the leather portfolio behind the chest at the foot of her bed. She thought of how she had held it and put it back and said nothing for 4 weeks. I know where they are, she said. He looked at her sharply. I found them when I was looking for the extra blanket. I didn't open them. I put them back. She held his gaze. I didn't know what they were then. I think I understand now what they are. A long silence. Those documents, he said carefully, are the only direct evidence that the 1877 survey was fraudulent. Then why haven't you used them? Because Crane has been the Territorial Land Commissioner for 9 years, and has a comfortable relationship with most of the judges in the circuit. He paused. Because the last witness I found who would speak to what happened in Hollow Creek in March of 1878 withdrew his statement 3 weeks before his deposition and left the territory. Because the official record says equipment failure, and the official record is what courts work from. He paused again. And because Pearl is the heir to the Reeve claim, the moment she's visible in an official proceeding, Crane has standing to challenge her status, her guardianship, every element of her situation, as long as he doesn't know where she is. She's not in his direct line of attention, Iris said. She's safe because she's invisible. He looked at her. Which changes, she said, if he saw what I think he saw when he looked past your shoulder at Pearl's door. Caden said nothing. Did you see his face when he looked? She asked. No, I was watching you. I saw it, she said. He knew. Not necessarily all of it, not necessarily that she was the Reeve girl specifically. But he knew there was a child in this cabin, and he came out here for a reason, and the reason was to find out what Caden Harrow has been keeping up in the mountains for 3 years. Pearl said quietly, My grandfather's name was Thomas. Caden looked at her. Yes. You never said that before. You said grandfather, but you didn't say Thomas. No, I should have. She was looking at him with an expression that was not accusation and not forgiveness, but something more careful than either the expression of a person integrating new information into an existing structure of understanding and checking that the structure holds. She opened her sketchbook to a new page and wrote. She wrote slowly and carefully the way she wrote things she wanted to keep. Thomas Reeve. Below that, Joseph Reeve. Below that, Pearl Reeve Harrow. She showed the page to Caden. He looked at it for a long time. His face did what it did sometimes in very still moments, move beneath its surface the way light moves under deep water. Yes, he said. That's right. Pearl closed the sketchbook and held it in her lap and looked at the fire. Crane came back in 10 days with a formal notice. It arrived via a Greystone Pass deputy who rode up on a Tuesday morning looking uncomfortable about his errand, which Iris noted because deputies who are uncomfortable about their errands are deputies who have been asked to deliver something they don't feel clean about. The notice was printed on official territorial letterhead and cited a statute she was not familiar with, but looked up immediately in the territorial law volume she'd ordered through Birch's store in town. Territorial statute requiring documentation of unaccompanied minors residing on private property. Registration with the county recorder's office. Legal guardianship filed on record. 14 days to comply. She read it 3 times. Then she looked up the statute itself, which was real, and read the original language, and then read the commentary on it in the legal digest that accompanied the volume, which explained that the statute had been enacted to protect orphan children and ensure their legal status was recorded. The statute existed for a legitimate purpose. Crane was using it for a different one. This is a legal mechanism to make Pearl visible in the official records, she said to Caden when she had finished reading. Once she's visible, he can file a competing claim, challenge your legal standing as her guardian, claim the estate should be administered by the territory, which under his office means administered by him. He controls what happens to the Reeve claim. She put the notice down. He wants her visible in the records so he can challenge everything. Caden looked at the notice. I don't have legal guardianship documentation. I just took her. I didn't file anything because filing anything made her visible. I know. She looked at the survey folio on the table between them. She had brought it out the night before, and they had begun going through it together, and it was more than she had expected. Not just the original 1869 survey work, but 9 years of careful accumulation copies of the 1877 documents with handwritten annotations marking the specific discrepancies, correspondence, the field notes from the original survey. We need to file for guardianship, formally, with the documentation that establishes why you have the right to it. The moment I file, he'll contest it. Yes, which is why the affidavit needs to be airtight before we file. She looked at him steadily. You are listed as co-surveyor on the original Reeve claim. Yes. You have continuous care of the Reeve heir for 4 years. Yes. You have original survey documentation showing the 1877 filing was fraudulent. Yes. Then you have legal standing to file for guardianship of Pearl as the surviving co-claimant on the Reeve estate, and you have the evidence to support it. She paused. The filing itself forces the fraud into the record. He has to contest it in a documented court proceeding. He can't make it disappear if it's in the official record. He was looking at her in a way she had not seen before. Not assessment exactly, not the careful watching he usually gave her, but something that recognized something, as though he were in the presence of an approach that had not occurred to him and was now obviously correct. "This requires going to Greystone Pass," he said. "Yes." "The recorder's office." "Yes." "I haven't been in Greystone Pass in 3 years." He looked at his hands, then at her. "People will want to know things." "Let them want," she said. "You have 14 days, and I know how to draft an affidavit." From the table, Pearl said, "I think she's right." They both looked at her. She was reading the Territorial Law Digest, which she had apparently taken from the table, and opened to the guardianship section while they were talking. "The statute says legal standing can be established by documented relationship to the child's estate," Pearl said. "He has that. He has the survey records." She looked at Caden. "It says so right here." Caden looked at his 9-year-old daughter reading territorial law at the kitchen table. "We'd need the documents in proper order," he said. "Then let's put them in order," Iris said. "I'll start tonight." They worked on the affidavit for 3 nights. This was not anything Iris had anticipated about the shape her life in the mountains would take. But she had been sitting here for 5 weeks by now, and the shape that life took was rarely the one anticipated, which was a lesson she had been in the process of learning since December, and was continuing to learn in some depth. She and Caden sat at the table after Pearl went to sleep. The survey documents spread between them, and she drafted and he corrected, and they built it together in the way that 2 people build something when each of them has knowledge the other doesn't. He had the surveys, he could read them as fluently as she could read prose, all the notation and measurement and boundary language resolving itself in his mind into actual ground. He had walked and measured and marked. He knew which line on the 1877 documents was impossible, and could say precisely why, citing the specific distance markers and topographical features that contradicted it. She had language. She had the habit of written argument her father had instilled in her by letting her read every survey report he drafted before he filed it. She knew how to build a case in prose sequentially, each claim followed by its evidence, each piece of evidence sourced and attributed, and cross-referenced, the whole structure designed so that a reader following it from beginning to end arrived at the conclusion with the same inevitability they would have arrived at if they'd been in Hollow Creek in 1869 themselves. She drafted, he reviewed, she revised, he corrected the survey language. She made the corrections and reviewed the whole for internal consistency, and then showed him what she'd changed and explained why, and he followed the reasoning and either agreed or pointed to where she'd misread something, and she made notes and started the next section. It was quiet work. The fire spoke and the wind moved and Pearl slept, and the cabin held the cold outside and let the lamp do its work over the documents spread on the table. On the second night, Pearl appeared in the doorway of her room at 11 o'clock in her wool nightgown with her sketchbook and sat down at the table without asking permission. Neither adult told her to go back to bed. She read the draft affidavit for 20 minutes without comment, and then opened her sketchbook and began drawing the documents on the table with the same precise archival quality she gave to everything she thought was worth preserving. On the third night, when the final version was complete and checked and copied clean, Pearl picked up the pen before Caden could reach for it. She wrote her name at the bottom of the last page. Pearl Reeve Harrow. Both parts. Caden looked at his daughter's name on the document for a long time. Then he took the pen. His signature went below hers, Caden Daniel Harrow, co-surveyor of Record Hollow Creek Basin. Survey Wyoming Territory, 1869. Iris witnessed both signatures. Her name went last, Iris Merritt Colby witness. She put the pen down and looked at the finished affidavit on the table and thought, "This is the best work I have ever done. Not as a teacher, not in a classroom. This document built at this table over 3 nights with a man who carried the weight of 9 years alone and a child who read territorial law to help him is the best work I have ever done." She did not say this out loud. She did not need to. But between the 3 nights of affidavit work and the morning they rode into Greystone Pass, there was a week that Iris would later think of as the week the cabin changed. Not in its materials, the walls and the floor and the stove and the window were what they had always been, but in its quality. The quality of a place changes when the people in it begin to stop keeping things from each other, and this was, she thought, what was happening. Caden had told her the whole of it. Pearl had heard the whole of it for the first time, and the three of them were now operating in the same understanding of their situation, rather than the fractured understandings of people who have been careful with each other. Careful has a cost. It costs warmth. It costs the particular ease that comes when the people you live with are working from the same information you are. The week felt for the first time since December like something that might eventually become ordinary. Good ordinary. The kind you build rather than the kind that simply happens. Pearl took a long walk on the third afternoon of that week. The first long walk she had taken since Crane's visit. They had been cautious about her ranging far from the cabin after that afternoon, and she had understood and complied with the caution, but had not particularly liked it. She came back with her sketchbook full and snow on her boots, and the expression of someone who has been somewhere they needed to go. She spread the pages on the table and showed Iris each one, the lower meadow under its February snow cover, the creek visible as a dark line where the cold hadn't fully taken it yet, 3 deer at the tree line that she had stood very still for the particular angle of the afternoon light off the mountains at 4 o'clock. I drew the boundary line, she said, finding the page. It was a map hand-drawn with the valley laid out and the creek running through it and 2 lines marked in different ink, one solid and labeled 1869, one dashed and labeled 1877. From the survey documents, I wanted to see where it would be in the actual landscape. Iris looked at the map. It was accurate. She had spent enough time with the survey documents by now to verify this without effort. The 2 lines were different enough that you would not have to be a surveyor to understand that one of them was wrong, not if you were looking at the actual ground. "May I keep this?" Iris asked. "Why?" "Because it belongs in the affidavit package. It's the clearest visual demonstration of the discrepancy I've seen, and it's made by someone who grew up near that valley." She paused. "A jury would understand this page faster than they'd understand the technical survey language." Pearl looked at her map. Inspector Foss said there might be a jury. Eventually, it could be a long time from now, but this would help. It might help very much. Pearl considered this. Then she carefully removed the page from her sketchbook. She had never, in the time Iris had been here, removed a page from her sketchbook. It was the kind of thing a person notes, and gave it to Iris. "Put it with the other documents," she said. "I will." Pearl picked up a fresh pencil and started drawing the map again from the beginning, exactly as it had been, because now she knew it well enough to draw it twice. On the 5th evening of that week, she found Caden at the workbench at 9 o'clock, late for him, with the lantern pulled close, and Thomas Reeves' original field notebook open in front of him. She had not known this notebook existed. It was different from the survey documents, which were official records. This was a personal field notebook, the kind surveyors kept as their working record, before the formal documentation was compiled, full of handwritten notes and quick measurements and small sketches of landmarks. The kind of record that meant more to the person who made it than to anyone outside the work. She stood in the doorway for a moment, not sure whether to intrude. He heard her and looked up. Then he looked back at the notebook. "Thomas's," he said. "I guessed. I've had it since March of '78. I went back to the Hollow Creek homestead before I left with Pearl, and I took what I thought she should have eventually. Letters, the photograph, this." He touched the edge of the notebook. "I've read it probably a dozen times." And Mom. She came into the room and sat at the table nearby, at an angle that let her see him without watching him directly, which was the angle she'd learned he was most comfortable with when they were talking about things that mattered. "He wrote well," Caden said. "Not stylishly like a man who wrote to think, to work things out. Field notes, but also observations. What he noticed." He was quiet for a moment. "There's an entry from August of '69, the summer we were surveying the basin. He writes about the color of the water in the East Creek in late afternoon. He says it looks like hammered silver when the light comes in at that angle." He stopped. "I was with him when he wrote that. We'd stopped at the creek to water the horses. I remember exactly what that water looked like." She said nothing. "I've been thinking about whether I told Pearl enough," he said, "about who he was, who they were." "You told her tonight what she needed most," Iris said carefully. "The shape of it, the facts." "Facts aren't the same as knowing." "No," she said. "You're right." She paused. "Read her the field notes. Not all at once, a few pages at a time. Let her ask you to explain things. That's how she'll learn to know him, through the things he noticed and the things you can tell her about what he was like when he was noticing them." She paused. You were there. He was quiet for a long time. The lantern put its light over the notebook and over his hands, which were resting on either side of it. Yes, he said. I was there. He looked at the notebook for another moment. Then he closed it carefully. I'll read her the August entry tomorrow morning, he said. He did. Iris sat at the other end of the table and pretended to be attending to the supply ledger, and Pearl sat across from Caden and listened to him read her grandfather's words about the East Creek in late summer of 1869, and when he finished, Pearl opened her sketchbook and drew what her grandfather had described. Hammered silver water. She had never seen the creek in summer, but she drew it from the words, and when she showed it to Caden, he looked at it for a long time. That's right, he said. Pearl added it to the page she'd made with the names. Thomas Reeve, Joseph Reeve, Pearl Reeve Harrow. Below the names, the water. Greystone Pass in January was a different town than the one Iris had arrived in. December had been the month of bracing shuttering, stocking the last wagons coming in before the roads got serious. January was the month of having braced the town closed in on itself and functioning the main road packed hard by horses and traffic moving over the same snow repeatedly until it had the character of pavement, the storefronts looking out through frosted glass with the settled patience of things that had made their peace with the season. She had been to Greystone Pass twice since December for supplies, and she had the town's geography and personalities cataloged in the particular way a school teacher catalogs a new environment. Everett Birch at the general store, voluble and encyclopedic, who knew everything that had happened in the territory for the past 15 years and offered it freely. Arvin Holt at the station, reliable and quiet, who knew more than he said and said exactly as much as was useful. The hotel, the doctor's office, the church, the land commissioner's local sub-office, a small official building with drawn curtains and a territorial seal above the door that gave off the particular atmosphere of official buildings that have something to protect. And at the end of the main road, the recorder's office, a two-story building with wide windows and a vestibule, and a front room behind a counter that smelled of paper and ink, and the particular archival quality of a space where official documents were kept in excellent order. She knew because Arvin Holt had mentioned it in the course of supplying information he considered relevant to her situation, that the recorder was a woman named Vera Nettlewood, who had held the position for 6 years and was known to be scrupulous in a way that some people in the territory found inconvenient. They were going to need scrupulous. The morning they rode into town, Caden brushed both horses before they left. She watched him do it from the porch, her coat on, and her bag over her shoulder with the affidavit and the survey documents inside it, the original folio, and the copies wrapped in oilcloth against the weather. He brushed the horses the way he did everything, with full attention and no wasted motion, and she understood that this was not efficiency. This was preparation. Something to do with his hands while he did what he needed to do in his head. He had put on his good wool shirt, the dark one that fit him better than the flannel he wore for work. He had cleaned his boots. He had stood at the small mirror above the washstand for perhaps 30 seconds, looking at whatever it was his face offered him, and then apparently decided that what was there was what there was, and he would take it into town. Pearl came out of her room already dressed when it was time to go. Caden looked at her. "You're staying here." "No," Pearl said. It was not argumentative. It was simply a statement of the actual state of things. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him with the steady, patient attention she gave to situations she had already worked through and arrived at a settled conclusion on. She was wearing her better coat, the one Iris had helped her let out at the hem last month to accommodate the growth she'd had since Caden bought it, and her sketchbook was under her arm. "My name is on that document," Pearl said. "My grandfather's claim, my father." She paused. "I want to be there when it's filed." He looked at her for the length of time it took to understand that there was no counter-argument available that would address what she had just said. Then, "Stay between the two of us. Don't go anywhere alone." "Obviously," Pearl said, and went to get her hat. Greystone Pass received the three of them in the particular way that small mountain towns receive unusual information, not loudly but thoroughly. Arvin Holt at the station saw them coming along the main road and raised one hand in a nod that said, "I see you, and I'm not going to make a thing of it," which was the nod of a man who had made a deliberate and private decision some time ago about what his relationship to the situation was going to be. Everett Birch came out onto the steps of his general store as they passed. He was wearing his apron and holding a flour sack, and he looked at Caden Harrow on a horse on the main road of Greystone Pass. Something that Iris gathered from the quality of his looking had not happened in 3 years. And then he looked at Iris, and then he looked at Pearl. His face went through several things in rapid succession, and he opened his mouth and then clearly decided that this was not the moment and closed it again. Two women stopped in the middle of the road ahead of them with their baskets and looked. A man coming out of the hotel stood on the steps and watched them pass. Three boys sitting on the fence of the livery at the far end of the road watched with the frank, unguarded attention of boys who have not yet learned to disguise interest. Caden rode as though none of this was happening, which was either remarkable self-possession or the particular quality of a man who had decided something and was too occupied with what he'd decided to attend to anything adjacent to it. Iris rode beside him and kept her own face neutral and watched the street ahead. Pearl rode on Caden's left side between him and the storefronts and watched everything with her sketchbook against her chest and her dark eyes moving steadily. The recorder's office was warm when they went in the stove in the corner, doing its work against the January cold, the front room behind the counter smelling of the specific institutional cleanliness of a well-run office. Vera Nettlewood was behind the counter reviewing a document, and she looked up when they came through the door with the focused attention of a woman who processes considerable information daily and has learned to sort it efficiently. She looked at Caden Harrow, she looked at Iris, she looked at Pearl. "Mr. Harrow," she said. Her voice was measured, not warm, not cold, the temperature of a professional in the presence of something significant. "Mrs. Nettlewood." He put the affidavit on the counter. She picked it up and read it. She read it the way she read everything Iris suspected front to back, without skipping, with full attention on each page before moving to the next. She was on page 3 when Iris saw her face do something very controlled. She kept reading. She reached page 7, where the specific annotation of the boundary discrepancy between the 1869 and 1877 documents was laid out with side-by-side measurements, and she set the document down carefully. She looked at Caden Harrow. "This makes significant claims about documents in this office's record," she said. "Everything in it is supported by the materials here." Iris placed the supporting documentation on the counter. The original 1869 surveys, the oilcloth-wrapped copies of the 1877 documents, with Caden's handwritten annotations, the comparison table she had prepared showing the specific discrepancies at each boundary point. Mrs. Nettlewood looked at Iris for the first time with what appeared to be full attention. "Who are you?" "Iris Colby. I was a school teacher in Chicago before I came to Wyoming. My father was a county property surveyor for 20 years. I drafted the affidavit." "You drafted this?" "With Mr. Harrow. He has the survey knowledge. I have the documentary structure." Mrs. Nettlewood looked at the documents on her counter. She looked at Caden. She looked at Pearl, who was standing very straight with her sketchbook under her arm and her eyes moving steadily around the room, noting things. "I'll need 2 hours to review this properly," she said. They went to wait at the hotel. 1 hour and 40 minutes into the wait, Caden stood up from the table in the hotel dining room and put on his coat. He had been sitting with his coffee untouched in the particular stillness of a man whose attention is entirely elsewhere. And then he stood. "He's here," he said. She hadn't heard anything. She stood up anyway. They came out of the hotel and Aldous Crane was in the street in front of the recorder's office, with 2 men behind him standing the way men stand when they are making a point about space with enough physical presence to communicate that the space around them is theirs. He had a horse behind him, and the 2 men had horses, and Crane himself was wearing his good coat in the January cold and looked entirely comfortable in it. He smiled when he saw them coming down the hotel steps. "Mr. Harrow," he said. "What a coincidence." "It isn't," Caden said. "No," Crane agreed pleasantly. "I received word that some documents had been filed with Mrs. Nettlewood's office. Given the nature of the claims involved, I thought it worth discussing before any official recording action was taken." "The filing is in order," Iris said. "Mrs. Nettlewood has the paperwork." He looked at her with the specific quality of attention he had been giving her since her first morning in the territory, the attention of a man who has categorized a situation and is not yet certain whether the category is correct. "Miss Colby, you've been very thorough." "I'm a thorough person," she said. "Indeed," he glanced at Pearl. Pearl met his gaze directly, which seemed to take him a quarter second to process. "And Miss Reeve." He said it pleasantly as though the name were simply information. Pearl said, "My name is Pearl Harrow. Both parts." Something moved in Crane's eyes, gone before it fully formed. He turned back to Caden. "Those documents contain claims that contest records of this office. The 1877 survey was reviewed and certified by my predecessor. Whatever documentation Mr. Harrow has preserved from 1869 represents superseded material." "Superseded by documents your office produced," Iris said. "We note that in the affidavit, the specific discrepancy between the 1869 and 1877 boundary notations is annotated on pages 6 and 7 with measurements from the original field notes." "Miss Colby." His voice did not change, but something under it changed the way the surface of water doesn't change, but the current beneath it does. "I want to be direct with you. You came to this territory under an arrangement that didn't work out. You're in an uncertain situation, no formal ties to the property, no legal standing. Whatever you believe you're doing with this filing, you should understand that you're in no position to navigate whatever follows from it." She was aware of the street around them. The two women who had stopped with their baskets when they'd ridden in were still there on the far side of the road. Everett Birch had appeared in his storefront doorway. A man coming out of the land commissioner's sub-office had stopped on the steps. "There is money," Crane said quietly. "Enough to make a very comfortable new start. Somewhere with considerably better prospects than a mountain cabin." She looked at him and she made sure her voice carried, "Are you offering me money to withdraw a legal filing?" Mr. Crane, his smile held perfectly, but his eyes moved through something very fast. "I'm discussing available options," he said. "That's all." "I'd prefer to discuss options inside Mrs. Nettlewood's office," she said, "with a third party present. She's expecting us." Crane stepped aside from the door. He did it smoothly as a man who has spent decades calculating what each action communicates. He stepped aside because the alternative was blocking the door in front of witnesses on the main road of Greystone Pass, and that was not an available move for him. Iris went up the 2 steps. Caden moved to follow her. One of the large men shifted his weight. Not fully, not yet, still in the territory of implication rather than action. Caden moved through the implication. She heard rather than saw what happened. The sound of bodies in the corner of the doorframe, and a grunt in a very short, sharp exchange, and then Caden was through the door, one hand pressed to the side of his face, where he'd gone into something on the way through, and Pearl was beside Iris inside the recorder's vestibule, and the door was shut. "Bar it," Caden said. Iris dropped the bar. Outside voices. Crane's controlled. One of the men's less so. Then quiet. Caden took his hand from his face. Blood from a cut above his left eye where he'd gone into the door corner, not deep, the kind of cut that bleeds considerably before it amounts to much. Pearl looked at the cut. She went to the recorder's counter and found a clean cloth. There was always a clean cloth in offices maintained by people like Vera Nettlewood, and held it out to him. He took it and pressed it to his face without comment. The inner door opened. Vera Nettlewood looked at the three of them in her vestibule at the barred outer door at the blood on the cloth in Caden's hand. Her face arranged itself. "Come in," she said. "All 3 of you." The inner office was a room Iris would remember for the rest of her life. Not because it was remarkable, it was a plain room with a desk and shelves of carefully labeled document boxes and a coal stove in the corner, but because of what happened in it. Vera Nettlewood sat down behind her desk and folded her hands on top of the affidavit and the supporting documents and looked at Caden Harrow. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I sent a letter to the federal land inspector's office 6 weeks ago." The room was quiet for a moment. "I've been the recorder in this office for 6 years," she said. "Survey documents come through this office. I record what's brought to me, that's my function. I don't have enforcement authority, but I can flag discrepancies in the record." She looked at the affidavit. The 1877 survey documents for the Hollow Creek Basin were brought to this office by Commissioner Crane's predecessor in office and recorded as certified. I recorded them, but I looked at them as I look at everything that comes through this office. She paused. "They didn't match the 1869 originals." Caden said very quietly, "You knew." "I knew something was wrong. I didn't know all of what I now understand from reading your affidavit. And I had no enforcement authority and no evidentiary standing. A recorder can note a discrepancy, but cannot conduct an investigation." She looked at him steadily. "I wrote to the federal land inspector's office in November citing the 1877 documents as potentially fraudulent and requesting a formal review. I did not mention your name or Pearl's because I didn't know your full situation. I simply flagged the documents. And Iris said, the response I received 2 weeks ago. She opened her desk drawer and produced a letter on federal letterhead. Inspector Hartwell Foss of the Federal Land Office is conducting a broader investigation of this territory's land commissioner's records. He has been conducting it for 14 months. He has been looking for a specific evidentiary connection between the 1877 Hollow Creek documents and the decision-making of Commissioner Crane's office. She looked at the supporting materials on her desk. Your original survey documentation is that connection. It establishes not just that the 1877 filing was inaccurate, but that the inaccuracy was deliberate, because anyone who surveyed that ground and then saw the 1877 documents would know immediately that the boundary change was impossible. She looked at Caden. Inspector Foss arrives in Greystone Pass on Thursday, she said. He's been in Cheyenne. He intended to contact you. He'd found your name in the 1869 survey records, but didn't know how to find you. He apparently did not know about Pearl. She paused. Your affidavit is, I believe, exactly what he has been waiting for. Outside, nothing. Crane's voice had gone away at some point, which was either reassuring or not, depending on what he decided to do with his afternoon. Pearl was sitting in the chair nearest the stove with her sketchbook open. She was drawing the room, the desk, the document shelves, the 3 adults, the affidavit on the desk, the supporting materials in their oilcloth wrapping with the concentrated precision she brought to things she intended to preserve. A record of what was real. Caden lowered the cloth from his eye. The bleeding had nearly stopped. Thursday, he said. Thursday, Mrs. Nettlewood confirmed. She looked at the affidavit again, and something in her face did what competent professional people's faces do when they encounter work they recognize as having been done well. Miss Colby, this is an excellent document. Thank you, Iris said. It's going to hold up. I know, Iris said. Pearl looked up from her sketchbook. She showed no one the drawing. She put the book back under her arm and reached across the space between her chair and Caden's and took his hand large and scarred and still holding the blood-stained cloth closed around hers. He held her hand and looked at the window and at whatever was outside it, the January street, the mountains beyond the buildings, the long way back up to the cabin through the pines. He looked as though he had set something down. They spent the night at the hotel in Greystone Pass. This had not been the plan. The plan had been to file meet with Inspector Foss on Thursday and return to the cabin. But the barred door of Mrs. Nettlewood's office and the condition of the road after dark and the collective decision that staying together in a visible public place was safer than riding 11 miles into the mountains in the dark while Crane was still in town produced the outcome of 3 rooms at the hotel and a very large supper in the dining room. Pearl ate 2 portions of beef stew and read the menu with the interest of a person encountering a new document type. She examined the printed cards for each table setting and the painted sign above the serving counter and the chalkboard with the daily specials in a hand she apparently found interesting because she spent 4 minutes studying it before she picked up her pencil. Don't draw the customers, Iris said. I wasn't going to, Pearl said and drew the chalkboard. Caden ate his supper across from Iris and said very little, which was usual, but she had learned to distinguish between the varieties of his silence. This was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. This was the silence of someone who was processing a significant amount. The afternoon the documents Inspector Foss Crane on the street, the stay filed and executed, and had not yet arrived at any conclusions he felt ready to express. She let him have it. She had learned that he arrived at things in his own time and that the arrival was worth waiting for. He arrived at it after supper when Pearl was asleep in her room and they were sitting in the hotel's small common room with the fire and 2 cups of coffee. I've been thinking about Hollow Creek, he said. She looked at him. Not about the case, about taking Pearl to see it. When this is over, when it's been concluded properly, I've been thinking she should see the land. He looked at his coffee cup. She's been carrying an idea of it. The map she drew, the things I've told her. It's all secondhand. She should see the actual ground. Yes, Iris said. She should. The homestead is gone. Someone else bought it when Thomas died, but the creek is still there. The survey stakes we set in '69 are probably still there if you know where to look. He paused. I want to show her where Thomas found the hammered silver water. He would have wanted her to see it. She had not known he was still thinking about the field notebook. She had known he was still feeling it, that was visible, but she had not known the specific form the feeling was taking. When it's over, she said, "We'll take her." He nodded once. It was the nod he gave to things that had been decided. The fire worked in the grate between them, and the hotel settled around them in its January night. And she thought about the map on the table and the photograph in the box, and the field notebook with the August entry about the color of the water. And she thought about Pearl drawing her grandfather's land from description. And she thought about what it meant to carry something for someone, all the weight of witness, of remembrance, of being the surviving person who was there. Caden had been carrying all of it for 9 years. He had carried it alone. "I want to say something," she said. He looked at her. "What you did coming back for Pearl, keeping her safe, preserving those documents for 9 years coming back into town today, after 3 years to file, most people would not have done any of it." She said it plainly the way he said things. Most people would have found a reasonable justification for not doing it. It would have been easy to find. She paused. "You didn't find one. I think that matters." He looked at her for a long moment. "Thomas would have done it," he said. "Yes," she said. "He would have, but he didn't have to because you were here." Another silence. The fire went on doing its work. "Pearl told me," he said, "on the second day you were in the cabin, I was coming back from the barn, and she was at the window, and she said, 'I think she'll stay.'" He looked at the fire. "She's generally right about people." Iris looked at her coffee cup and then at him and said nothing for a moment. "She was right about you," he said. The fire held them both in its light for a moment. Then she said, "She's a remarkable person." "Yes," he said, "she is." He did not say more than that. He did not need to. She was beginning to understand that the things he said mattered in proportion to how many words they took, and that the things he said in very few words were the ones that had been sitting with him for the longest time. She finished her coffee. "We should sleep," she said. "Inspector Foss comes at 9. "Yes," he said. They said good night in the way that people say it when what they've said in the previous hour has moved something between them that will need to be addressed eventually, and both of them know it, but neither of them is going to address it tonight, and went to their separate rooms in the Greystone Pass Hotel, while outside the January cold held the territory, and the mountains were invisible in the dark, but there. Inspector Hartwell Foss arrived on Thursday as promised. He was a compact, unremarkable man in a good traveling coat. The kind of unremarkable that Iris recognized in the course of their first conversation as deliberate rather than natural. He had the quality of someone who has learned to take up very little of the room he enters so that people speak more freely than they would if they felt observed. He had been conducting this investigation for 14 months. The fact that he had conducted it without anyone who needed not to know finding out about it suggested that being unremarkable was a significant professional skill. He came to Mrs. Nettlewood's office at 9 in the morning and shook hands and sat down and read the affidavit and the supporting documents for 35 minutes without speaking. Not just reading, working through it, comparing the 1869 and 1877 documents against each other, making notes in a small leather book, occasionally returning to a previous page to cross-check something. Then he put it all down. "You've been building this for 9 years, he said to Caden. "Yes. And you understand what this process looks like from here." "I understand that it won't be quick," Caden said, "and that Crane has resources and will use them." "He will." Inspector Foss looked at the documents. "What you've given me here is the evidentiary anchor I've been missing. I had the anomalies in Crane's office records. There are multiple properties besides the Reeve claim where the survey documentation shows the same pattern of unexplained boundary shifts, all of them correlating with mineral deposits and all of them between 1876 and 1879, which is the period when Crane's associate was most active in the territory. What I did not have was a surviving original survey signed by the original surveyor showing specifically and provably what the correct boundary was." He looked at Caden. "Your 1869 survey documents are the only surviving original in the group. You signed them. You surveyed that ground. Your testimony as to what those documents show is not inferential, it is direct knowledge." "I was there," Caden said. "Yes, that's the difference." Inspector Foss looked at Iris. "In your affidavit, the written structure linking the fraudulent documents to the mine collapse and the deaths, that's the causation chain. That's what a jury needs." He set his hands flat on the desk. "I'm going to be honest with you. This will take time. 6 months minimum for the federal indictment to be prepared and filed. The trial could be 2 years out. Crane has a team of attorneys in Cheyenne who are good at their work." He paused. But I can file a countervailing motion today that stays the guardianship proceeding Crane initiated this morning. He filed this morning, Iris said. He filed an emergency petition at the territorial court in Cheyenne at 7 o'clock this morning, claiming Pearl is an unregistered ward with no legal guardian of documented standing. The inspector's expression was neutral. He's been planning this. Your visit to the recorder's office accelerated his timeline. She felt Caden's stillness beside her, not the stillness of a person staying calm, but the stillness of a person who has been expecting something and has just had it arrive. With the federal investigation formally open and the stay in place, his leverage changes substantially, Inspector Foss said. Crane operates through official channels. When the official channels are working against him, his options narrow. The stay protects Pearl's status while the case proceeds. He looked at Caden. I won't tell you there is no risk. There will be things I can't predict, but it's different from where you were 48 hours ago. He executed the federal stay that afternoon in Mrs. Nettlewood's office with Vera Nettlewood as official recorder and Iris as witness, and Pearl sitting in the corner chair with her sketchbook and her characteristic stillness, and a look on her face that was the look of someone who has been patient about something for a very long time and can feel the weight of it beginning to shift. Aldous Crane was in Greystone Pass that evening. Iris saw him from the hotel window walking the main road at dusk, and she understood what he was doing, assessing, recalculating, determining what his remaining options were. He was a man who operated by measured steps, and measured steps required knowing precisely where the ground was. She watched him walk and thought the ground is different now than it was this morning, and he knows it. He left Greystone Pass the next day. He came back twice in the following weeks. Both times he was correct in his behavior and precise in his actions and made no further moves in person against Caden or Iris or Pearl. He was a man who understood that what happened from here happened in rooms with documents and attorneys and federal investigators, and he would conduct himself accordingly. This was in its way a relief. In the weeks that followed, Greystone Pass did what small towns do when something they have half known for a long time is finally confirmed. It integrated the information into its existing understanding of itself and decided how to go on. Everett Birch had known for years. He announced to anyone who asked that Caden Harrow was not quite as alone as he appeared to be. The evidence had been in the extra items. He'd ordered a child-sized pair of winter boots once 2 years ago, books that a 44-year-old trapper would not obviously have occasion for. He had not asked because he had known at some level that the not asking was what was required of him, and Birch was, for all his volubility, a man who understood the difference between knowing and saying. 2 men came forward to Inspector Foss's investigator in February. They had worked in the Hollow Creek Basin in 1877 and 1878, and they had information they had not felt safe providing before the federal investigation was formally open. They had been present at the mine the morning of the collapse. Their testimony, Inspector Foss reported through a letter to Caden, was significant. Aldous Crane remained in the territory through February, visible and correct, attending to the diminishing functions of his office with the careful attention of a man maintaining appearances he could not yet afford to drop. His associate had left the territory in January. 2 of the junior staff of the commissioner's office had already begun cooperation discussions with the federal investigation, which Inspector Foss had also noted. March came. The snow in the lower valley began to release. Pearl discovered with the specific joy of a person encountering something they have known abstractly for a long time, and are now encountering concretely, that the meadows below the cabin contained wildflowers in spring. She had read about Wyoming wildflowers. She had studied the illustrations in the natural history book, and in 2 additional volumes Iris had ordered through Birch's store, one of them, a botanical survey of the Mountain West with colored plates. She had drawn the illustrations from memory in her sketchbook and labeled them with their Latin and common names. She knew that phlox would appear first, and then shooting star, and then the later season blooms that came when the higher meadows opened. But knowing a thing and encountering it in a field on a March morning, when the snow is still on the peaks, and the valley floor is muddy and new, and the air smells of the particular freshness of ground that has been under snow for 4 months and has just been released. These are different orders of experience. She moved through the meadow below the cabin with her sketchbook and her new colored pencils, cataloging everything she found, and the sound of her moving through the emerging grass and calling out names, Phlox, Iris, it's the phlox, was the sound of a person who had been held in a small space for a very long time and was just now discovering that there was more room than they had been given access to. Caden watched her from the tree line with the expression Iris had been collecting for 4 months. She could read most of his expressions now. This one was the expression he made when he was confronting happiness that he did not quite know how to accommodate. She was watching Pearl work in the meadow on a Tuesday in late April when Caden came up behind her with an envelope. She looked at it. The Westward Venture Matrimonial Agency, letterhead Chicago. She had written to them 3 times since December. The first 2 responses had been brief and professional. They had recorded her situation. They were reviewing the correspondence from Mr. Deese. They would be in touch. She had assumed that being in touch meant a formal acknowledgement of the arrangement's failure and a pro forma apology and some guidance about her legal standing with respect to travel expenses. She opened the envelope. The letter was longer than the previous 2. It began with a formal apology, which she read past, and then it explained in the careful language of an organization covering a significant failure that in the course of a comprehensive review of their correspondence files from the autumn of 1882, they had discovered a letter that had not been forwarded as required. The letter was enclosed. She unfolded the enclosure. It was from Franklin Deese. It was dated 6 weeks before she had boarded the train in Chicago. It was addressed to the agency. She read it. He had contracted a severe fever in early November. His physician had told him he would not be fit to travel before spring at the earliest and possibly not until summer. And he did not think it right to ask a woman to come west to marry a man who was bedridden and who could not say when or whether he would recover properly. He apologized for the disruption. He asked the agency to inform Miss Colby and to cancel the arrangement at his expense. He enclosed a bank draft to cover any costs. He had tried to cancel. He had tried to tell her. The agency had received his letter and his bank draft and had failed to forward either to her, and she had gotten on the train without knowing and had arrived at Greystone Pass Station on a December evening without knowing and had stood on a frozen platform waiting for a man she now understood had not failed to come for her, but had tried from a sickbed in a house she had never seen to reach her. She had not been abandoned. She had been redirected. By a postal failure and a man's illness and an agency's error, in a December blizzard over the Absaroka range, redirected to a train platform where a tall man with a scarred face had come out of the shadows because he could not watch a woman freeze. She stood in the meadow in April with the letter in both hands and felt the strange, specific weight of understanding that this was where she had always been going to end up. Not because fate arranged it, she did not believe in fate as a coherent force. She had thought about this, but because the sequence of things that had happened had been exactly sufficient to bring her here, and she was here, and she was still standing. Iris, Caden said. She looked at him. He was watching her face with those gray eyes that she had spent 4 months learning and had not finished learning and did not think she would finish learning for a long time yet. And what she saw in them was what had been there for some time, without either of them addressing it directly, the way the mountains had been there before the clouds moved and after permanent patient, not requiring acknowledgement, but there. She looked at Pearl in the meadow, who had looked up at the sound of her name, and was watching the 2 adults with the focused, ungovernable attention of a child who knows what she's watching. "Pearl," Iris said. "Yes," Pearl's voice carrying across the grass. "You asked me once before the snow cleared whether I would stay." "You didn't answer," Pearl said. "I noticed. I'm answering now." She looked at Caden. "I crossed most of a country because of an advertisement in a plan that had nothing to do with where I ended up." She looked at the mountains behind him, at the cabin visible through the pines at the edge of the meadow, at Pearl standing in the new grass with her sketchbook and her colored pencils. "I came here for a purpose I had entirely wrong, and I found something I didn't know was possible to find." She paused. "Something I didn't know I was looking for." "That's not technically an answer," Pearl observed helpfully from the meadow. "It is one," Iris said. "I'm staying." Pearl nodded once with the satisfied composure of someone who has known the correct answer for some time and has simply been waiting for the question to be completed. Caden Harrow looked at Iris Colby in the April light with the expression she had been watching develop for 4 months, not quite a smile. The architecture of one, the specific movement of a face that has spent a long time in the process of being very careful and is in the early stages of no longer needing to be quite so careful about this particular thing. He said, "The cabin needs a 3rd room. I've been thinking about where to add it." It was so entirely the way he would say the thing that she found. She had to look away for a moment at the mountains at the meadow, at anything neutral, because the warmth that came up in her chest was the kind that needed a moment to settle before she could speak over it. East facing, she said, for the morning light. East facing, he agreed. The federal investigation produced its results in stages over the following 18 months. Crane was recalled to Cheyenne in April and formally deposed in May. His associate accepted a cooperation agreement in June and provided testimony that confirmed the timeline of the boundary manipulation and the specific financial relationships behind the 1877 document production. Two of the Cheyenne surveyors who had been contracted to produce the fraudulent documents came forward, one voluntarily and one under subpoena. Aldous Crane was indicted in September on 6 federal counts: fraudulent land grant documentation conspiracy in the suppression of a mine safety inquiry, 2 counts related to the obstruction of the 1878 investigation, and 2 counts directly related to the deaths of Thomas and Joseph Reeve. His attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement that reduced the first count to a single composite charge and allowed him to avoid trial on the final 2 in exchange for a full accounting of all properties affected by his office's activities between 1876 and 1882. There were 11 such properties identified in the final accounting. The Reeve claim was the largest. The Territorial Land Commissioner's office was restructured under new administration that winter. The Reeve claim, the original 1869 claim with its original boundaries as surveyed and recorded by Thomas Reeve and Caden Harrow, was formally reinstated in December in the name of Pearl Reeve Harrow Minor, with Caden Daniel Harrow as legal guardian of record. Mrs. Nettlewood recorded it herself. Pearl sat at the table in the cabin on a Tuesday morning in December, 2 years after Iris had stepped off the train at Greystone Pass, and read the reinstatement document 3 times. She put it flat on the table and looked at it for a while. "My grandfather filed the first one," she said. "He did," Caden said. "My father would have inherited it." "Yes." She looked at the document with the look she gave to things she was putting in permanent memory. "And now it's mine." "Now it's yours." She opened her sketchbook to a fresh page and began to draw. She drew the Hollow Creek Basin as she had seen it in September, when the investigation was nearly concluded and it was safe to take her there. The valley in September, the lake grass golden, and the creek still running clear the eastern hillside where the survey stakes from 1869 had still been in the ground when Caden looked for them, weathered and gray but there. She drew her grandfather's land. When she finished, she signed the bottom corner of the page, Pearl Reeve Harrow, both parts. Then she dated it. She turned the page over and started a new drawing, and this one was the cabin in December, with smoke from the chimney and the snow around it, deep and even, and the light in the window, the light of a house where people were doing things in the evening. They were married in September, a year after the investigation concluded, and 6 months before the indictment came down on a Tuesday afternoon, with the cabin door open to the meadow and the mountains showing above the tree line. Pearl had been entrusted with the rings 4 days before the ceremony. She had not lost them. She had, however, drawn both of them several times in her sketchbook from different angles, as though she wished to have a permanent record of what they looked like before they were on people's hands. The minister came up from Greystone Pass. Mrs. Nettlewood had apparently been very persuasive and said the words that were required, and seemed genuinely moved by the setting, which was something Iris had not anticipated but found she appreciated. The door was open because she had asked for the light to come through from the meadow, and the light did come through across the wooden floor and touched the corner of the table where she and Caden had built the affidavit together in the winter, and where Pearl did her lessons in the morning. Arvin Holt was there. Vera Nettlewood was there. Everett Birch came with his wife, who brought a cake that was better than anything that could have been produced at this altitude with the available ingredients, and which Pearl ate 2 pieces of with focused satisfaction. 3 men who had known Thomas Reeve 20 years ago came from Hollow Creek, which no one had planned for, and which produced in the afternoon a moment where Caden stood with those 3 men near the porch, and very little was said, but something passed between them that had not been possible to pass for 9 years. Pearl drew it. She always drew the things that mattered. The Greystone Pass schoolroom opened the following fall. It had been Iris's proposal to the town council, prepared with the thoroughness that she brought to proposals she wanted to succeed. The enrollment projections, the budget, the curriculum outline, the building specifications, the letter from the Territorial Board of Education confirming that the certificated teacher she intended to hire was qualified for the position. The certificated teacher was herself. Several council members had expressed surprise at this, and she had explained patiently that she had 4 years of Chicago classroom experience and a certification from the Illinois Board of Education, and that the children of Greystone Pass deserved a teacher with credentials rather than without. The building was a converted supply room attached to the church with 2 new windows cut in the south wall for light and a good stove in the corner, and 23 desks ordered from a catalog in Denver. It smelled on the first morning of new wood and chalk dust, and the particular combination of cold and oil lamp that is the smell of school in a mountain town, which was not quite the same as coal smoke and wet wool, but which had a quality she found she liked considerably better. She had 21 students on the first day. Pearl was not among them. They had decided Pearl had argued and been overruled and had accepted the ruling with the dignity of someone noting for the record that they intend to revisit the subject next year, that Pearl would continue to be educated at the cabin for 1 more year to give her time to adjust to being visible in Greystone Pass before she was visible in a room full of children. Pearl's life for the past 4 years had been very private, and private things needed time to open without breaking. Pearl had accepted this. But at the end of the first afternoon, when the last student had gone home, and Iris was at the board reviewing what had worked and what needed adjustment, tomorrow she looked up at the south window and Pearl's face was there in the glass. Just a face looking in. Pearl had walked the 3 miles from the cabin to the schoolroom and was standing outside the window watching the classroom with the intent, undeceivable attention she brought to everything she thought was worth seeing. Iris looked at her through the glass. Pearl held up her sketchbook. She had been drawing. Of course she had. The room, the desks, the 21 children arranged at their places, the teacher at the board, all of it compressed into the sketchbook page with Pearl's characteristic precision. All 21 children individually rendered with the particular quality of line that meant she had actually looked at each of them. And outside the window, small in the lower corner of the drawing, but present, and looking in Pearl's own face. Iris pressed her fingertips to the glass. Pearl nodded once with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has confirmed something they already knew to be true, and turned and walked home through the September afternoon. Caden came at the end of the day to walk Iris back as he did when she didn't take the horse. He appeared in the schoolroom doorway with his hat in his hand and looked at her, standing at the chalkboard in the chalk dust of the day's work, and she watched his face do the thing it did now with some regularity, the thing that was the architecture of what she had spent 4 months thinking was something he was incapable of, and had turned out to be something he simply hadn't found sufficient reason for in a long time. "Good day," he said. "Very good." Pearl was at the window. "I know, she has 11 pages. He came into the room and looked at the desks and the board and the books on the shelf and the small stove in the corner doing its careful work. "It looks like a school." "It is a school," she said. "Next year Pearl will be in it." "Next year," he said. She picked up her coat and her bag, and she walked to the door where he was standing, and they went out into the September light together, into the air that smelled of pine and altitude and the specific quality of a Wyoming afternoon in the last warmth of the year before the cold came back. Behind them, the schoolroom held its desks and its chalk and its 23 books, in the beginning of everything that a room like that is the beginning of. Ahead of them, 3 miles up through the pines, was the cabin with the east-facing room and the survey map still on the shelf, and Pearl's drawings covering most of one wall, and the fire already built up for the evening because Pearl, who had walked back from the schoolroom window, was home and had seen to it. She took Caden's arm. He put his hand over hers, which was his way of saying what he rarely needed other means to say. They walked home through the September light, and behind them the mountains held the whole of what had happened here, the station and the blizzard and the open door, and the child in the doorway, and 3 nights at a table in the main road and the recorder's office, and all of it, everything, the entire sequence of things that had been exactly sufficient. The mountains held it the way mountains hold things, permanently, without needing anyone's opinion about it. They had been there before she arrived, and they would be there after, and that was all right. She was here now. She was staying.